For the first time in Decision Desk HQ and the Hill's forecast model this election cycle, former President Trump has overtaken Vice President Harris with a 52% chance of winning the election this November. Since late August, the model has shown Harris holding a slight edge over Trump, shifting between 54 and 56%. But since the beginning of October, the dynamics have begun to shift, showing the former president gaining ground. The Hill's national political reporter Cate Martel joins us with the latest update from Decision Desk HQ. Cate, as always, it's great to see you. It seems like the headlines have former President Trump gaining the momentum. The momentum is behind him. It seems that polls are certainly starting to turn in his favor. It is narrow, but what do you think is behind this shifting tide, not only in those national polls, but more importantly in the swing states?
In the swing states particularly, Julia, I think what's responsible for this shift in momentum is particularly in Wisconsin and Michigan. We're starting to see polls improving for former President Trump in those very key, important battleground states. Now, I would attribute this to we are done with the summer enthusiasm and excitement that Vice President Harris was a beneficiary of, and now we've moved into more of the meat of the campaign. It's been obviously a very condensed campaign, and now that she's done a lot more media interviews, some of them not friendly, including the Fox News interview last week, that it's opening her up to more scrutiny. I think that's what we're starting to see, but as we keep stressing, Julia, that now we are very much within the margin of error in all 7 of these battleground states. So I don't think that we can say that, yes, that just because former President Trump is slightly favored in these models, that I don't think that necessarily means this race is over.
So you mentioned the battleground state of Michigan. Kamala Harris was in Detroit this past weekend campaigning with Lizzo. She later went to Georgia. Former President Trump spent all of his time this weekend in Pennsylvania. Are those the 2 battleground states that we think are going to, along with states like Georgia, are they going to shift the tide? I mean, PA, for example, has a mammoth number of electoral college votes for a swing state, making it so unique. But, what are the battleground states saying right now?
Yeah, when you look at all 7 battleground states, like I said earlier, none of them are within more of a 2-point lead for either candidate. And of the 7, Vice President Harris is only leading in Pennsylvania now. The others are completely tied or slightly favoring former President Trump. Now, as you mentioned, Pennsylvania is the biggest get when it comes to electoral college votes among these battleground states. And that's why we're seeing both Harris and Trump spending an enormous time in those states. For example, Vice President Harris is spending her day today in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All 3 of those incredibly important states. And who's joining her on the campaign trail? Former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. That shows me that she is trying to make a play on some of these Republican voters and more independent-minded voters, that she's hoping that she can pick away some of those, and that's why she is favoring all 3 of those states today.
Yeah, Democrats certainly confident they can at least peel off a little chunk of Republican voters, but I thought it was interesting Senator Lindsey Graham forcefully, pushing back on that, saying, I think over the weekend to those Republican voters, what the hell are you doing? So certainly getting heated in terms of that rhetoric. When we talk about the polls, there's so much, skepticism towards them going back to 2016, even before that, because they don't always get it right. And some of these polls are right-leaning, some are left-leaning, but there's been more coverage of how particularly right-leaning or Republican-leaning polls could be impacting some of these polling averages, the forecasts we're seeing. How big of a factor do you ultimately think this is?
It's a good question, Julia, because like you mentioned, it is a really hard job that pollsters have, and sometimes they get it wrong. And for example, older voters are much easier to poll than younger voters, and these are certain factors that we see pollsters on both sides trying to factor in. So there's no perfect science to this. Now, there has been some criticism that there have been a lot of Republican-leaning polls coming in over the past few weeks. And is that affecting some of these forecasts and models that we're seeing? And the experts that we're talking to are saying, I don't think so, that they are already factoring this in. Yes, we have polls from the left and the right, but we have a lot from independent middle ground pollsters. And yes, there might be slightly skewed, but also if you look at the broad picture, there aren't many outliers. they're mostly selling us the same thing. It is completely a dead heat race that could go in either direction. So yes, there might be a slight skew, but I don't think that's having a meaningful effect when you still look at the overall polling average, and they don't change that much in either direction.
Yeah, there was an Emerson College national poll released last week that showed 3% of voters are undecided. Seen some polls that show that number up to 6%, but such a small subgroup. Yeah. It's really going to come down to the wire. So as you mentioned before, as it's coming down to the wire, we are seeing these candidates all over the campaign trail. Trump made headlines this weekend going to McDonald's in Pennsylvania to work as a fry cook. He also was taking orders in the drive-through, answering voters' questions. An environment we haven't really seen Donald Trump in. But then he held a rally and talked about Arnold Palmer. I don't know how much of what he said at that rally I can repeat on television or YouTube, but certainly some interesting comments. I guess, what's the point of that?
That's an excellent question. Now, these comments were basically talking, for anyone who hasn't watched this, about the pro golfer's manhood. He veered off course from his rally and shifted gears. It's a good question. I'm not sure there's a particular demographic that this type of comment could help. Yes, it will make some people chuckle. I don't think it's exactly what Republicans want to be focusing on in the final 2 weeks of the campaign trail. They don't think that these types of comments, have a particular positive effect. But, Julia, none of us are new here. Former President Trump has been known to make controversial comments on the campaign trail, and we haven't traditionally seen them affect him too much. That he might have caught up in the moment, and now I think Republicans are avoiding as much as they can to talk about this. Specifically, Speaker Mike Johnson was asked about this over the weekend, and really seemed like he didn't want to talk about this. It's a bit of an uncomfortable remark.
Yeah, House Republicans and House Democrats may not be in session, but they're certainly being asked about all of this on the campaign trail. So sticking with Trump, he's attacked 60 Minutes on CBS after a Harris sit-down interview earlier this month. He's accused the program of essentially editing the interview. The 60 Minutes is saying this is false. What more is 60 Minutes saying? And I guess, how does this play into Trump's broader media strategy?
Yeah, well, 60 Minutes is defending themselves and is arguing that, yes, another clip might have aired on Face the Nation than the original 60 Minutes clip, but they argue they gave, quote unquote, a longer section to their colleagues at Face the Nation, that it didn't necessarily change the meat of what they were discussing, and it didn't change the angle at all. It was just a more full clip. Now, this does very much, like you say, play into former President Trump's criticisms of the media, that this very much gives him a tangible thing that he can tell his supporters on the campaign trail that, mainstream media outlets, in his terms, are favoring Vice President Harris and arguing that CBS News was trying to help out and make it a favorable interview for Harris. But like I said, 60 Minutes is trying to defend themselves and is arguing it doesn't actually change the meat of the exchange. It's just a slightly longer clip.
So I want to stick with that topic of criticizing the media. Billionaire Elon Musk, who's been campaigning with Trump, he has endorsed Trump, obviously. He posted on his social media platform and suggested that the media is encouraging not only assassination of former President Trump, but also him. I guess we've heard this sort of echoed in maybe some far-right circles, but now that it's being set on the campaign trail, it seems like it's moved into the mainstream. I mean, does this move the needle with any voters at all, against Trump, or could it, maybe even work in favor of Trump? I mean, I guess I'm just struggling to understand the strategy here because it seems so incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous is the right word to describe this. That, I think most Americans agree, particularly independents, that the temperature in American politics has gotten incredibly high. And after the first assassination attempt at former President Trump, both Trump and President Biden vowed not to continue the rhetoric and to try to bring the temperature down. And by Elon Musk making this type of comment, I think is just going to continue to make Americans uncomfortable. That it could potentially tap into this feeling that, people are uncomfortable with the temperature in American politics. But I think that also could backfire for Elon Musk, that, it's just continuing more of this rhetoric. And I don't think it'll necessarily help with a certain demographic. I could be wrong about this, but it just shows me how far and how deep we've gotten into this volatile season of American politics.
So sticking with Elon Musk, he's also announced a $1 million a day giveaway to anyone who signs his PAC petition. A lot of legal experts pushing back against that today. Is this even legal? I mean, how many challenges do we expect this is going to get?
Yeah, a lot of legal experts have a lot of issues with this of, whether you are trying to take money from from Elon Musk and trying to hand it out to individual voters. There do come with a lot of legal questions around this. There may be a loophole because, yes, he is requiring people to vote, but he's not necessarily requiring who people vote for. So that might be a potential loophole. But yes, there very much are legal implications, and it's causing experts, a lot of questions in both sides.
Definitely a lot of questions, and we know that Musk is certainly going to be someone who's going to be a presence on the campaign trail in the next 2 weeks, and also, on social media and the greater media. Yeah. So could be making a lot of headlines. As always, Cate Martel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Julia.
The House task force investigating the July attempt on former President Trump's life has released a report on their findings, and it's not good news for the Secret Service. The report called the shooting, quote, preventable, and said that law enforcement missed pivotal moments leading up to the assassination attempt. Washington correspondent Joe Khalil has more on the report.
Julia, the interim report that the House task force released today adds to the chorus of investigations and conclusions that the Secret Service failed in a damning way, not just one or two areas, but a series of failures that led to this July 13th attempted assassination on the former president. Their conclusion is it never should have happened, and it was certainly preventable. Now, remember, this is the House task force that was put together by the Speaker of the House, a Republican, and the Democratic House leader in a bipartisan way. For months now, they have held hearings. They visited Butler, Pennsylvania, the actual site. They've interviewed dozens of law enforcement officials, local and state, and also in the Secret Service. Some of their biggest takeaways are inadequate planning between the Secret Service and the locals before the rally started, failure to secure the actual AGR building where Thomas Crooks climbed up, and also a failure to include that building in the proper perimeter. So it was sort of an afterthought. There were also a series of red flags about Thomas Crooks that were noticed by witnesses on the ground, a number of law enforcement officials on the ground, and nearly all of them were ignored. There was virtually no action taken. In fact, multiple witnesses recognizing that Crooks was acting erratically, had concerning behavior, even noticing that he had a rangefinder. Yet again, very little action. This information was texted from local law enforcement officials to U.S. Secret Service, along with pictures of him, and still Donald Trump's detail was never made aware. This is an account from the report from a former Secret Service official talking to the committee, saying what should have happened is when the suspicious person was identified, the detail leader and the shift agent should have been told there's an issue, we're working a suspicious person. At that point, probably would have been inappropriate to remove the president from the stage, but the detail leader should have known there was an issue. So again, massive breakdowns there in communication and really jarring some of the accounts in the report describing how these officers encountered and saw Thomas Crooks. Now, remember here that this is the preliminary report. The larger one is going to be significantly bigger, that one coming out in December, and that one will also include the August incident outside of Mar-a-Lago in West Palm Beach, the second attempt on Donald Trump's life. But for now, this report again concluding that this was an absolutely preventable near assassination of the former president. Julia?
And thank you, Joe Khalil. New overnight, Israel launched attacks at several sites in southern Lebanon, targeting what Israel says is an alternative banking system operated by Hezbollah. It comes as a U.S. envoy is set to start peace talks with Lebanese officials in Beirut Monday. Last week, Israel gave U.S. officials a document listing its conditions for an end to the war in Lebanon. According to an Axios report, Israel demanded that its Air Force have the freedom to operate in Lebanese airspace and that the IDF IDF forces be allowed to engage in, quote, active enforcement in Lebanon to make sure Hezbollah doesn't rearm and rebuild their military infrastructure. A U.S. official told Axios it was unlikely that Lebanon or the international community would agree to those terms. Meantime, officials here in the U.S. are investigating how classified documents about Israel were leaked. The documents, marked top secrets, turned up on a pro-Iranian Telegram account on Friday. They describe preparations Israel appears to be making for a strike against Iran, including military drills and weapons placement. The documents were prepared in recent days by the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Some officials say if no further documents come to light, the damage would be limited. Others are calling the leak very concerning. It is still unclear if the documents were hacked or deliberately leaked. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.